What if the man who could buy the entire city chose to sit in a cracked vinyl booth every single morning and leave exactly $10 on the table? Not 9, not 20, always 10. For months, Emma Collins watched him walk through that door, and she convinced herself he was just another quiet regular. Then one Tuesday, she Googled his name on a whim and nearly dropped the coffee pot. He was worth $4 billion, and he still tipped $10. Why? The answer would shatter her heart and change her life forever. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button right now, because we drop stories every week that will make you laugh, ugly cry, and question everything you think you know about people. Smash that like button if you love stories about real human kindness, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, the way it always had, the way it probably always would. Emma Collins didn't mind the smell anymore. After 3 years of double shifts at Patty's Corner Diner on Aldrich Street, the smell had become something like comfort, proof that she'd shown up again, that she hadn't quit, that the lights were still on and her mother's medical bills were still, somehow, getting paid. She arrived at 6:45 every morning, 20 minutes before her shift technically started, because the morning prep never got done right if she wasn't there to do it herself. She tied her apron in the back, poured herself half a cup of whatever was left in the overnight pot, stale and slightly bitter, and started wiping down the tables nearest the window. She liked those 15 minutes before anyone else came in. The quiet had weight to it. At 7:14, she heard the door. The bell above it gave its usual flat clang, and Emma didn't look up right away. She finished the table she was on, tucked the rag into her apron pocket, and turned. He was already sitting in booth 4. He always chose booth 4. It was the one with the crack running diagonally across the seat cushion, the one nobody else wanted because the vinyl caught on fabric and the table wobbled if you set anything down on the left corner. But he sat there every morning like it was a reserved table at a fine restaurant, like the cracked seat wasn't pressing into the back of his thighs, like the wobbly table was perfectly fine. Emma picked up her notepad out of habit, even though she'd stopped needing it for his order months ago. "Morning," she said, pulling out the pad anyway. "Morning." His voice was the same as always, not warm, exactly, not cold, even, like a man who'd made peace with a lot of things. Landon Pierce was 32 years old, though he looked a little older in certain lights, the way men do when they've carried something heavy for a long time. He was tall enough that he had to angle himself slightly to fit comfortably in the booth, but he never complained about that either. He had dark circles under his eyes most mornings, the kind that come not from one bad night but from many months of interrupted sleep. And his clothes were always simple. Dark jeans, a plain button-down, usually navy or gray, a watch that Emma had eventually looked up online and discovered cost $4,300, which had genuinely surprised her because the rest of him looked like a man who shopped at a regular department store and didn't think much about it. "Same?" she asked. "Same. Coffee, black, wheat toast, butter on the side." He nodded. She wrote it down anyway. Old habit. She was back in 4 minutes with the coffee. Fresh pot, she always made sure of that, even though he'd never once complained about stale coffee, even though he'd never complained about anything, and the toast on a small plate with 2 of the little foil butter packs beside it. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it. That much she'd figured out early. He wasn't the kind of person who said things just to fill silence. Emma gave a small nod and turned to go check on the only other occupied table, an older couple in the corner who came in every Tuesday and Thursday and split a single stack of pancakes between them and were absolutely, quietly in love in the way that people are after 40 years, where they don't need to perform it for anyone. She refilled their water, brought them more syrup without being asked, and made her way back behind the counter. From there, she could see booth 4 without obviously watching it. Landon had his phone out, but he wasn't scrolling the way most people did, mindlessly, burning time. He was reading something, and whatever it was had his full attention, a slight crease between his brows, his coffee getting slightly cold beside him because he kept forgetting to drink it. He had a daughter. Emma knew this because the little girl sometimes came in with him on Friday mornings. A 7-year-old named Lily, with her father's same serious eyes and her own completely different energy, loud in the good way, the way children are when they feel safe, asking Emma what her favorite color was and whether the diner had a cat and why the floor was black and white like a chessboard. Lily asked questions the way other people breathed. Landon would watch her talk to Emma with this expression that was difficult to name, something between exhaustion and complete, helpless adoration. "She talks a lot," he'd said once, apologetically. "She's great," Emma had said, and meant it. Lily wasn't here today. It was a Wednesday, and on Wednesdays it was just him. Emma poured herself another half cup of coffee, still bad, still a little burnt, and leaned against the counter. She'd been watching him for months now, the way you can't help but watch something that doesn't quite make sense. Not in a strange way. In the way of a puzzle that sits on the edge of your thinking even when you're not actively working on it. It wasn't the man himself exactly. It was the $10. Every single morning, without variation, without looking at the bill, without calculating the percentage. Before he stood up, before he put his jacket back on, he'd reach into his wallet and pull out a $10 bill, always crisp, always like he'd put it there specifically for this, and he'd set it flat on the table beside his empty cup. His bill was never more than $6.50, sometimes $5.75, on mornings when he didn't finish the toast. The $10 tip made no mathematical sense, and it also didn't make the kind of sense that generous tippers made, the ones who left 30–40% because they were flush, or because they'd had a good day, or because they wanted you to know it. This wasn't a display. He didn't look at her when he left it. He didn't wait for her reaction. He just left it and walked out. Emma had counted, eventually. By her rough estimate, this man had tipped her somewhere in the neighborhood of $800 over the 8 months she'd been noticing. More, maybe. Maybe from the very first day, before she'd started paying attention. She'd asked Patty about him once. Patty owned the diner, had owned it for 20 years, was 61 years old, and had opinions about everything, and softened for almost nothing. "The guy in booth 4, Emma had said. "You know who he is?" Patty had barely looked up from the register. "Regular. He tips the same amount every single day, exactly $10. "People have their ways," Patty said. "Don't stare at it." That wasn't an answer, but Patty had a way of closing conversations that made you feel like pressing would cost you something, so Emma had let it go. She watched him drink his coffee now. He'd remembered it finally, 3 sips in quick succession, and thought, not for the first time, that there was something lonely about him. Not sad, exactly. He didn't carry himself like a sad person. It was more that he existed in a particular kind of self-contained quiet that most people didn't settle into until they'd lost something they couldn't replace. She recognized it because she'd been carrying something like it herself for the past 2 years. Since her mother's diagnosis. Since the bills started stacking up with a kind of dark patience, like they knew they'd outlast her eventually. But she didn't want to think about that right now. She topped off his coffee without being asked. He glanced up and gave her a brief nod of thanks, the kind that felt oddly sincere for how small it was, and went to handle the morning rush that was starting to trickle through the door. The rush lasted until about 9:30, at which point the diner settled back into its mid-morning quiet. By then, Landon was long gone. Emma cleared booth 4, wiped the table, and found the $10 bill where he always left it, flat beside the coffee cup, no wrinkles. She stood there for a moment holding it. $800, she thought, maybe more. She folded it and tucked it into her apron with the rest of the morning's tips and tried to remember whether she had enough left on her grocery card to cover her mother's prescriptions this week. Oops. She found out who he was on a Tuesday, 6 weeks later. It was an accident, or close enough. She typed his name into the search bar on her phone initially to see if he was on social media. This wasn't stalking, she told herself. This was just the thing people did when someone was mysterious at them for long enough. He'd mentioned his name once, early on, during one of their brief morning conversations. Landon Pierce. Said it casually, the way people do when they're not used to their name meaning anything in particular, or when they've trained themselves to say it that way. The first result was a Forbes profile. She nearly did drop the coffee pot. Landon Pierce, 32, founder and CEO of Pierce Capital Group, estimated net worth $4.1 billion. She put the phone face down on the counter and stood very still for a moment. $4 billion. She looked over at booth 4. He was there, same as every morning, reading something on his phone with the same slight crease between his brows, his coffee getting cold beside him. $4 billion. Dark circles. Navy button-down. Cracked vinyl seat. $10 tip. Emma spent the rest of that shift trying to behave normally and mostly failed. She was too aware of him in a way that felt uncomfortable, like suddenly seeing a piece of furniture that had always been in the room and realizing it was actually a work of art, and you'd been setting grocery bags on it. When he stood to leave, she intercepted him at the edge of the booth, which she'd never done before. He stopped, slightly surprised. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked at her. His expression was neutral but not unkind. "Sure. It's personal. Sort of. You don't have to answer." "Okay," he said, which was not a refusal. Emma folded her arms over her apron, then unfolded them because it looked defensive. "The tip," she said. "The $10 every morning. I've been wondering—" She stopped. "Sorry, it's not my business." Landon tilted his head slightly. He studied her for a moment, not in a way that felt intrusive, more like he was making a decision about something. "Not right now, he said. "But I'll tell you. I'll tell you, just not today." He picked up his jacket from the seat. "It's a long story." "Okay," Emma said. "It's a good reason," he said. "I'm not being weird. I didn't say you were being weird. You were thinking it." Emma almost laughed, which caught her off guard. "I've been thinking it for 8 months, she admitted. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but close to the shape of one. "Fair enough," he said. He left, and on the table, as always, was the $10 bill. Okay. In the weeks that followed, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching would have been able to name, but perceptibly. Like two people who've been in the same room for a long time and finally stopped pretending they weren't aware of each other. He started talking more in the mornings. Not long conversations. He was never there for more than 30 minutes, and she had other tables to manage. But more than the yes or no exchanges they'd had for months. She found out that Lily was in 2nd grade and had recently decided she wanted to be either a marine biologist or a YouTube star, and that Landon was doing his best to take both options seriously. She found out that he lived about 12 minutes from the diner and drove himself, which surprised her given what she now knew about his bank account. She found out that he read actual books, not just documents and reports, and that he had strong opinions about coffee that he kept to himself while sitting in a diner that served mediocre coffee every morning. "Why here?" she asked once, when the diner was quiet and she could afford to stand at his table for a few extra minutes. "If you're—" She didn't say the number. "I mean, you could go anywhere." Landon wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and thought about it, which was something she'd noticed he did with most questions. He didn't rush toward answers. "I like it here," he said finally. "That's not really an answer." "I know." He looked up at her. "I'll tell you that part too, when I tell you the rest." She'd started to understand that whatever the story was, it wasn't something he shared easily. It wasn't that he was withholding it to be mysterious. He was protecting it, the way you protect something that still had the ability to hurt you if handled carelessly. So she didn't push. She refilled his coffee and went back to her tables. Emma's mother was named Carol, and she had a form of autoimmune disease that had taken 3 doctors and 14 months to correctly diagnose, and which had not become less expensive to treat once they finally understood what it was. Carol was 58 and stubborn in the way that people are when stubbornness has kept them alive through things that should have broken them. Emma's father leaving when Emma was 11, a house fire that took most of what they owned when Emma was 16, and now this, the illness that came without warning and stayed without apology. She never complained in front of Emma. Emma knew this was an act of love, and she knew that her mother knew that Emma could see through it, and that they both pretended otherwise because some kindnesses only work if you let them. Emma had applied for nursing school 2 years before she ever met Landon Pierce. She'd gotten in. She'd deferred. She'd deferred again. The money didn't add up, and Carol's prescriptions didn't care about Emma's timelines. She hadn't told anyone at the diner about nursing school except Patty, who had said, characteristically, "Then do it." which was easier to say than to do, and Patty likely knew that, but believed in the value of simple instructions regardless. She'd mentioned it once to Landon, not to impress him, not because she thought a billionaire could solve her problems, but because he'd asked her, one slow Thursday morning, what she'd be doing if she weren't doing this. She'd answered before she thought about it. "Nursing," she said. He'd looked at her with the evaluating look she'd come to recognize. "What's stopping you?" She'd almost laughed. "Time, money, the usual. Those aren't nothing," he said. "No," she agreed. "They're not." He didn't offer to fix it. She hadn't wanted him to. But he'd nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're filing something away somewhere, and she found herself thinking, days later, that it was one of the more respectful responses she'd gotten to that particular answer. Most people either offered solutions they couldn't deliver or looked at her with a pity she couldn't afford to absorb. He'd just said, "Those aren't nothing." Like he understood that the obstacles were real, like he wasn't going to talk her out of their weight. By the time October settled over the city, Emma had stopped trying to figure Landon Pierce out and had started simply knowing him, which were different things. She knew his coffee order and that he took it at a specific temperature. She knew that Lily's school started at 8 and that he was always slightly tense on mornings when he'd clearly had to navigate a 7-year-old's complex emotional weather before arriving. She knew that he had a particular kind of stillness that wasn't passivity. It was the stillness of a person who'd learned to be careful with their energy because they couldn't afford to spend it carelessly. She knew, too, that something about her diner, her cracked vinyl, bad coffee, slightly lopsided diner, anchored him in a way she hadn't yet been given the full story to understand. But the story was coming, he'd promised. And on a gray Wednesday morning in November, with rain running sideways down the windows and the diner almost entirely empty, Landon Pierce sat down in booth 4, wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, and looked at Emma with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the measuring look, not the almost smile, something older than both. "You still want to know about the $10? He said. Emma set down the coffee pot and pulled out the chair across from him. "Yes," she said, and he began. The rain had been going since before dawn, and by the time Landon started talking, it had settled into the kind of steady, patient downpour that made the whole city feel smaller, like the world had pulled itself in close and decided to listen. Emma hadn't moved from the chair across from him. She'd meant to go check on the kitchen, meant to refill the napkin dispensers, meant to do any of the dozen small tasks that filled her mornings, but she didn't. She sat with her hands folded on the edge of the table and waited, and the diner was quiet enough that she could hear the rain hitting the awning outside in uneven bursts. Landon looked down at his coffee cup for a long moment, not avoiding her, thinking, deciding maybe where a story like this actually began. "I was 9, he said finally, when my father died." Emma didn't say anything. She knew the shape of that sentence well enough to know that adding words to it too quickly was a mistake. "Heart attack," he continued. "No warning, no build-up. Just gone. He was 41. He turned the coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, a small, unconscious movement. "My mother was 38. I was 9. My sister was 6. "Where were you?" Emma asked. "When it happened?" "School." He paused. "My mother was at work. A neighbor came to get us." He didn't elaborate on that, and something in his tone made clear that the details of that afternoon lived in a compartment he wasn't opening right now. "Anyway, after that, it was just her, just the three of us." He explained it the way someone explains something they've revisited so many times it's worn smooth. Not without feeling, but without the jagged edges that fresh grief has. His mother, whose name was Ruth, had been working part-time at a dry cleaner's when his father died. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, she'd taken a second job, nights at a diner 3 blocks from their apartment in a part of the city that didn't get written about much in local newspapers, except when something went wrong. "It was called Maze," he said. "It doesn't exist anymore. The building's a parking garage now." He almost smiled at that, not warmly. "She worked there 6 nights a week. Me and my sister would be asleep by the time she got home. She'd be up again at 6 to get us ready for school." He stopped. "I don't know when she slept. I never figured that out." Emma thought about her own mother, awake at 2 in the morning, insisting she wasn't in pain and felt something move in her chest. She kept her face still. This went on for about 2 years, Landon said. We were managing, not well, but managing. Then the winter I was 11, he stopped, picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking. The dry cleaners closed. The owner retired, didn't give much notice. My mom was down to just the diner, and the diner paid what diners paid. He looked at Emma in a way that acknowledged what they both understood about that number. We got behind on rent. We got behind on the electric bill. She was doing these calculations every night at the kitchen table, moving numbers around like if she rearranged them enough times, they'd add up to something different. Did she know you could see her doing that? Emma asked. Landon looked at her. No, he said, or she thought she was hiding it. I'd pretend I was asleep. He was quiet for a moment. I was 11. I understood more than she thought I did and less than I thought I did. That's a bad combination. Emma nodded. She had been 14 when she first understood that her own mother was frightened, really frightened, about money. Not in the way children understand that things cost money and sometimes you can't have things, but in the way you understand that fear as a physical fact, as something that occupies the body and changes the quality of a person's silence. 14 was late to learn it. 11 was early. December, Landon said. That's when it got the worst. We had heat, but barely. My mom was making soup last 3 days by adding water to it. He said this without self-pity, as a plain fact, which somehow made it worse. She wasn't sleeping. She was starting to look worn down, like the effort of keeping everything upright was costing her something she didn't have extra of. He was quiet for several seconds. The rain hit the awning. Somewhere in the kitchen, Emma could hear the cook, Marcus, moving things around, the low clang of a pan. There was a regular at the diner, Landon said. My mom mentioned him once, only once, because my mom didn't complain, and she didn't tell stories about her customers. That wasn't her way. But she mentioned him because she was trying to explain to me why she was different that day, less tired than she'd been. She said there was a man who came in every morning, quiet guy, didn't say much, and he left $10 every day. Emma went very still. The diner tab was small. It was a cheap place. It's not like people were running up bills, but $10 on a $5 order every single morning. Landon shook his head slowly. She said it was the first week of December, right when things were at the worst, and that $10 every morning was enough for groceries. For the week, she was 3 days from not being able to feed us properly. He stopped talking. Emma realized she'd been holding her breath slightly and let it go quietly. She never found out who he was, Landon said. She asked the owner, the woman who ran the place, May herself, and May said she didn't know his name. He'd been coming in for years, paid cash, never made conversation. He just came in, ate his food, left the money, like it was something he'd decided to do and then did it without needing anything back from it. And she never talked to him. Your mom. She thanked him once, Landon said. The first week, when she was starting to understand it wasn't an accident, she said something like, she said thank you, that it meant a lot. And he looked at her and said something like, just doing what I can, and went back to his paper. He paused. That was all she got. He stopped coming in sometime in the spring. She never saw him again. Emma looked at the $10 bill sitting on the edge of the table. She'd stopped seeing it as a curiosity or a puzzle. It looked different now. Heavier, somehow. She made me promise, Landon said, and his voice had changed slightly on those words. Quieter, more careful. Before she died, she passed about 4 years ago. It was her heart, which is its own terrible irony. He caught himself, took a breath. Before she went, she made me sit with her, and she told me that story again. She said she'd thought about that man her whole life. Not in an obsessive way, just she wondered who he was. She wondered what made someone do something like that, consistently, without acknowledgement, without it being a big gesture. She said she thought that was what genuine kindness looked like. Not a moment, a practice. He finally drank his coffee. Emma watched his face and said nothing. She made me promise that if I ever got to a point where I had something to give, that I'd do it. Not occasionally, regularly. That I'd find someone working the kind of hours she worked, and I'd leave $10 every morning the way that man had, without making it a thing, without turning it into a story about me. He set the cup down. So, that's what I do. Emma was aware, in that particular uncomfortable way, that her eyes were filling. She blinked it back hard. This was not the place for that. Or maybe it was exactly the place, but she wasn't going to. How long have you been doing it? She asked. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. 7 years, Landon said. Different diners. I move around. I don't want it to become something people expect or gossip about or turn into a thing. I stay until it feels like it's time to go somewhere else. He looked at her directly. I've been here 11 months. She calculated that quickly, against what she'd estimated earlier, and came out higher. She didn't say anything about that. Why this place? She asked instead. He looked around the diner slowly. The black and white floor, the counter with its spinning stools, the coffee machine that was older than both of them, the window with its view of the wet street. It looked like May's, he said. Not exactly, but enough. Emma nodded. She looked down at her hands on the table. She could feel him watching her. Not uncomfortably, but the way a person watches someone when they've handed them something fragile and they want to see if it'll be okay. Thank you for telling me, she said. You asked, he said. You could have kept saying you'd tell me later. Yeah, he said. I could have. He didn't explain why he'd chosen today instead. Maybe the rain. Maybe something else. People made decisions like that for reasons that didn't always translate into sentences. She stood up, straightening her apron. I'm going to refill your coffee, she said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She took his cup and walked to the counter and stood there for a moment with her back to him, one hand flat on the cool formica, just breathing, letting the story settle into the space it needed. Then she refilled his cup and brought it back. The weeks after that conversation changed the texture of the mornings in ways that were difficult to specify. They talked more. Not about heavy things, mostly. The weight of what he'd shared seemed to have done something paradoxical, loosened the air between them rather than made it denser. It was like two people who'd been navigating around a large piece of furniture had finally moved it and could walk through the room normally. He knew about nursing school now, the real version. Not just that she'd thought about it, but that she'd been accepted, that she'd deferred twice, that the math had never worked out, that she'd started to suspect the math would never work out, and was trying to figure out what she did with that. What does it cost? He asked one morning. Not in the way someone asks when they're about to offer to solve it, in the way someone asks when they want to actually understand a problem. Emma gave him the number. Tuition, books, the practical hours. What it would cost to have someone cover some of Carol's care on the days the schedule would have been impossible. He nodded slowly. And you've looked at loans? I've looked at everything, she said. It came out flatter than she meant it to. Sorry. Don't be, he said. That was a dumb question. Of course you have. She appreciated that. Most people, when they heard the number, immediately generated a list of solutions as though she hadn't already spent several exhausting years going through every one of them. It felt like being told that a door was there when you'd already spent years pressing your hands against its surface. I'm going to figure it out, she said. Not to convince him, to say it out loud, which was different. Landon looked at her with that particular evaluating expression she'd come to know. Yeah, he said. I think you will. She didn't know why that landed the way it did. She wasn't the kind of person who needed a billionaire's vote of confidence to believe in herself. But there was something about the way he said it, like he was reading something in her that he trusted, not just offering encouragement because encouragement was the socially correct thing to offer. Yeah. December came, and with it a particular quality of cold that made the diner feel even more like refuge than usual. The morning regulars started coming in, stamping their feet and pulling off scarves, and Emma kept the coffee fresh and the warmth going and made sure everyone got what they needed before they had to ask. It was the first Friday of December, the kind where the light came in pale and sideways through the window, the kind of light that made everything look a little more significant than it maybe was, when Lily came in with her father. This had become a ritual that Emma looked forward to more than she'd have admitted. Lily had opinions about everything and delivered them at the volume and speed of someone who'd been saving them up since the previous Friday. "Emma," Lily announced, climbing into booth 4 and immediately dropping her backpack on the floor. "I have made a decision." "Lay it on me," Emma said. "I'm going to be a marine biologist and a YouTube star," Lily said. "Both, at the same time. I'll study fish and then I'll make videos about the fish." "That's a solid plan," Emma said seriously. "I know," Lily said, equally serious. Landon was watching this exchange with his coffee halfway to his mouth, and there was that expression again. Exhausted, utterly undone by his daughter in the best possible way. "Can I tell you something?" Lily said, leaning across the table toward Emma, voice dropping to the conspiratorial register that 7-year-olds deploy with tremendous lack of subtlety. "Sure," Emma said. "My dad talks about you." Emma glanced at Landon. He had very carefully become interested in his toast. "Does he?" Emma said. "He says you're the hardest working person he knows," Lily said. "Except for Grandma. But Grandma's not here anymore, so you're the hardest working person he knows." The toast had apparently become very interesting to Landon. "That's really kind," Emma said. She looked at Lily's small, earnest face and felt something she hadn't quite felt in a while. The specific warmth that comes not from being desired or needed, but from being seen. "Your dad's pretty hard-working himself." Lily considered this. "He works too much," she said. "I tell him that." "She does," Landon confirmed, without looking up from the toast. "He needs to have more fun," Lily said. Then, as though this followed logically. "Do you like board games?" "I love board games," Emma said. "We have Clue," Lily said. "And Ticket to Ride. Dad's bad at Ticket to Ride." "I'm not bad at it," Landon said. "I have a different strategy." "Your strategy is losing," Lily said. Emma laughed before she could stop it, a real laugh, not a polite one. Landon finally looked up from his toast and caught her eye, and something happened in that fraction of a second that she couldn't quite name and didn't try to. She went to get Lily's hot chocolate with 2 marshmallows, which was Lily's standard order, and stood at the counter for a moment with her back to the room. She thought about Carol, who would be awake by now, moving slowly around their small apartment, making herself tea, turning on the morning news at a low volume. She thought about what the math looked like right now, still, after all her rearranging of it. She thought about nursing school and the deferral letter and the folder on her laptop that she opened occasionally and then closed without adding anything to. She thought about a man who'd walked into a diner 30-some years ago, ordered something cheap, and left $10 every morning for a struggling woman he didn't know, until she could stand on her own feet again, who hadn't needed acknowledgement, who'd just decided that this was what he could do, and did it. She put the 2 marshmallows in the hot chocolate and carried it back to booth 4. January. Then February. The city thawed unevenly, the way cities do, the south-facing streets losing their ice first, while the shaded ones stayed slick for weeks past the point where it seemed fair. Emma's mother had a harder month in February. There were 2 additional doctor visits, a medication adjustment that took 3 weeks to stabilize, and a stretch of 10 days where Carol was fatigued enough that Emma came home from her double shift to find her still in the chair where Emma had left her that morning, the TV running, dinner untouched on the counter. Emma made the dinner again, or made new dinner, the original being past saving, and sat beside her mother and ate together in the particular silence of 2 people who knew each other well enough to be quiet together without it meaning anything was wrong, even when something was wrong. "You look tired," Carol said, which was her way of saying she was sorry Emma was carrying so much. "I'm fine," Emma said, which was her way of saying she didn't want her mother to feel guilty. They both knew what each other meant. That was the thing about being close to someone for 30 years. The subtext got louder, and the surface words got quieter. "You should sleep," Carol said. "In a minute," Emma said. She did the dishes after, and checked Carol's pill organizer. Tuesday's compartment had the full count, which meant Carol had forgotten to take them, which Emma wordlessly refilled and set on the nightstand. Then she sat on the edge of her own bed in the small room she'd had since she was 16, The same room with the same water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like the state of Florida, and felt the weight of the day press down around her. She thought about the story Landon had told her. The soup stretched with water for 3 days. The kitchen table and the numbers that wouldn't add up differently. His mother, Ruth, who had worked 6 nights a week and somehow, sometime, slept enough to survive. Emma thought about the anonymous man and his $10, and for the first time understood the thing that had actually kept Ruth going. Not just the money, though the money was real, and it mattered. It was the evidence that someone knew she was there, that someone had seen her and decided, without fanfare and without needing credit, to do something about it. You couldn't put a number on what that did to a person. Emma turned off her light and lay in the dark and thought about nursing school with the particular ache of a person who hasn't given up on something but has started to mourn the version of themselves who had believed it would happen easily. Her phone lit up on the nightstand. A text from a number she'd saved as Booth 4, which had seemed less complicated than thinking too hard about what to save it as. Lily wanted me to tell you she's decided the YouTube channel will be called Fish with Lily, just so you know what to look for. Emma stared at the ceiling. The Florida-shaped water stain was invisible in the dark. She typed back, "I'll be her first subscriber." The response came quickly. "She'll hold you to that." Then, after a pause, "Hope your evening is okay." Emma looked at that last message for a long time. It was such a small thing to say. It was also, somehow, exactly right. Not, "Hope you're doing great," or "Let me know if you need anything," both of which would have felt like performances. Just, "Hope your evening is okay," which acknowledged that okay was sometimes the realistic ceiling, and that was fine. "Getting there," she typed back. "Thanks." She put the phone down and, for the first time in several weeks, fell asleep before midnight. Spring came like it usually does, late and abrupt, the cold hanging on 2 weeks past welcome and then vanishing overnight, and suddenly the trees on Aldrich Street were doing their thing, the small aggressive green of new leaves, the light coming back at a different angle. Landon had been coming to the diner for 14 months by then. Emma had stopped counting the $10 bills as a mystery to solve. She saw them now for what they were, a practice. A daily act of remembrance for a woman who'd stretched soup and worked nights and made her son promise something, and a promise kept every single morning by a man who'd turned that instruction into the closest thing he had to a ritual. She had started to understand something she hadn't understood the year before, that the most significant things in a person's life were often not the large dramatic events, but the small repeated choices. The thing you did every day without needing an audience for it. The commitment so old it had stopped feeling like discipline and started feeling like nature. She was thinking about that on a Thursday morning in late March, when Landon came in looking different than usual, not in his clothing or his posture, but in his face. Something was off. He sat in booth 4 and she brought his coffee, and he thanked her, but when she came back 3 minutes later to ask if he wanted his toast, he was staring at the surface of the table and hadn't touched the cup. She slid into the seat across from him without asking. "What happened?" she said. He looked up. The measuring look was gone. He just looked tired, the bone-deep kind. "Lily's sick," he said. "Just a flu," the doctor said. "But she had a fever last night of 103, and He stopped, pressed his hand against his mouth briefly, then lowered it. "I know it's fine. I know kids get fevers, but she was—" He exhaled through his nose. "She was crying and calling for her mom, and I didn't know what to do with that." Emma said nothing for a moment. Lily's mother. Emma realized she'd never asked, and he'd never offered, and the shape of that absence had simply been part of who he was. In the way that certain shapes become so familiar, you stop seeing their edges. "What do you do?" Emma asked quietly. "When she calls for her?" Landon looked at his hands. "I hold on," he said. "I just hold on until she stops." Emma sat with that. Outside, the new leaves on the Aldrich Street trees were doing their optimistic thing in the pale spring light. A car went by. Marcus dropped something in the kitchen. "She okay this morning?" Emma asked. "Fever broke around 4 a.m., he said. "She's with the sitter. She asked me to bring her back a hot chocolate." "With 2 marshmallows." "With 2 marshmallows," he confirmed. and something loosened slightly in his face. She'd be very upset if I came back with one. Go, Emma said. Take her the hot chocolate. I'll have Marcus make it. You don't… Landon! She said his name directly, which she realized she'd rarely done. He went quiet. Go take care of your kid. She got up and went to the counter and had Marcus make the hot chocolate, extra hot so it'd survive the drive, and put it in a to-go cup with a lid and put 2 marshmallows in a small paper bag on the side, because they'd dissolve if she put them in now. And she brought it to him with a paper sleeve on the cup so he wouldn't burn his hand. He looked at the bag of separate marshmallows. Something moved across his face that she didn't try to name. What do I owe you? He asked. Don't, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his wallet and placed the $10 bill on the table. He stood and picked up the hot chocolate and the small paper bag. Emma, he said. Yeah? He seemed to consider several things at once, the way people do when there are multiple sentences available, and they're trying to figure out which one is true enough to say out loud. Thank you, he said. It was the same thing he said every morning, but it didn't sound the same. She watched him walk out. Through the window, she could see him settle into his car, the to-go cup in the cup holder, the small paper bag on the passenger seat. He sat there for a moment before starting the engine. Emma picked up the $10 bill from the table. She thought about Ruth, who had stood at a diner counter 6 nights a week and loved her children with everything she had and more than she had, and who had told her son before she died that one quiet person leaving $10 every morning had given her enough to keep going. She thought about what it meant that a person could receive a kindness and hold it their whole life, and then turn it into something they gave away every morning for the rest of their own. She tucked the bill into her apron. The rain had started again outside, soft this time, the spring kind. Emma went to refill the napkin dispensers, and the Tuesday couple came in for their shared pancakes, and the morning kept going the way mornings do, steady and unremarkable, and full of small things that mattered. Lily recovered from her flu in 4 days, which felt like longer to Landon and shorter to Lily, who had strong opinions about the injustice of being kept home from school when she was clearly, obviously, almost entirely fine. By the 5th day, she was back in booth 4 on a Friday morning, announcing to Emma that she had used her sick days productively by planning the first 12 episodes of Fish with Lily, and that Emma needed to know that episode 3 would feature a deep-sea anglerfish and would probably be, in Lily's estimation, the most important piece of marine biology content ever made available to the public. Emma listened to all of this with the focused attention that Lily required and deserved, and brought the hot chocolate with the marshmallows on the side in a small paper bag, because she'd started doing that as a matter of course now, and Lily received this without comment, as though it had always been the arrangement, which in the way that mattered most, it had. Landon watched from across the booth with his hands around his coffee cup and said almost nothing, which was his particular way of being present, fully, without taking up more space than necessary. He looked better than he had on Thursday, less like a man who'd sat beside a feverish child at 4 in the morning, willing her temperature to drop through sheer force of not knowing what else to do. Episode 1, Emma said to Lily seriously. What's it about? Clownfish, Lily said. Because everyone knows Nemo, so it's a good entry point for my audience. Smart, Emma said. Know your audience. That's what my teacher says. Your teacher's right. Lily considered this, then glanced at her father. Emma agrees with my teacher more than you do. I agree with your teacher, Landon said. You said the clownfish episode was maybe not the most original choice. I said it could work, he said, which was apparently not the same thing in Lily's estimation, because she gave him a look of mild betrayal and turned back to Emma as the more reliable audience. Emma caught Landon's eye over Lily's head. He gave her the fractional almost smile, the specific one that had taken her months to learn to read, and she looked away before she did something her face would give away. April moved through the city the way April does, unpredictably, with warmth arriving in the morning and vanishing by afternoon, the trees holding their new green against the leftover cold. Emma's schedule had shifted to give her Tuesday afternoons off, a small administrative change that Patty had made without explanation, and which Emma suspected was not entirely accidental, though she didn't press on it. She used those Tuesday afternoons to study. Not nursing school. Not yet. Not formally. But she'd started pulling up the curriculum online, working through the prerequisite chapters on her laptop at the kitchen table while Carol napped in the next room, making notes in the margins of a spiral notebook she'd bought at the drugstore for $1.49. It was not a plan. It was what you did when you hadn't given up on something but couldn't afford to buy into it fully yet. You kept your hands in it. You didn't let it go entirely cold. She hadn't told Landon she was doing this. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because it felt too tender to name, this particular hope. The way certain plants look sturdier once they've been growing in the dark for a while, and you're afraid that light will be too much too fast. She'd told Carol, though, or Carol had found the notebook. "What's this?" Carol had asked one evening, holding it with the careful expression she used when she was trying not to make too much of something. "Nothing yet," Emma said, just keeping up." Carol had set the notebook down exactly where she'd found it and said nothing else. But the next morning, Emma found her mother's reading glasses sitting on top of it, which was Carol's way of saying, "I see you, and I believe in this." Emma had stood in this kitchen looking at those glasses on the notebook for a long time before she went to work. The morning it changed, the morning the specific shape of things shifted towards something neither of them had named out loud yet, was a Thursday in late April. Emma had come in at her usual time, done her usual prep, made her usual bad first cup of coffee. The diner was quiet the way it sometimes was on rainy mornings, when the regulars who drove stayed home, and only the ones who walked came in, shaking water from their jackets, grateful for the warmth. Landon arrived at 7:16, 1 minute late, which she noticed only because she'd stopped noticing his arrival consciously and had started noticing deviations from it. He sat in booth 4, and she brought his coffee, and he said thank you, and she said you're welcome, and went to handle the 2 other tables that needed attention. When she came back to his booth 20 minutes later to refill the cup, she found him not reading, not on his phone. He was looking out the window at the wet street with an expression she didn't recognize on him. Not sad exactly, but serious in a way that was different from his usual seriousness. Heavier. "You okay?" she asked. He looked at her. "My sister called last night," he said. Emma waited. "She found some of my mother's things. In storage. Ruth had a storage unit that neither of us knew about. It took us a while to track down. My sister's been going through it." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "She found the diner aprons." Emma sat down. "Ruth kept all of them," he said. "Years of them. Different diners, different names on the fronts, but she kept every single one." He was quiet a moment. "My sister said she found a rubber band around them, holding them together." He pressed his lips together briefly. "I don't know why that's the part that... I don't know. It just is." Emma didn't say anything. She understood the specific cruelty of small details. It wasn't the large, obvious things that broke you open. The funeral, the empty chair, the first holiday. It was the rubber band around a stack of old aprons, the reading glasses on a notebook. The small evidence of a person continuing to organize their life, fully intending to keep going. She was proud of the work, Emma said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Landon said. She was. She never talked about it like it was something to be ashamed of or something temporary she was tolerating until something better came along. It was just what she did, who she was. He looked at Emma. "That's what I thought about when I first came in here. You do that same thing." Emma blinked. "What thing?" "You're not waiting for this to be over," he said. "You're not treating this like a holding pattern. You're actually here." He picked up his coffee. "Most people in your situation treat the diner like a purgatory. You treat it like it's real." Emma looked at her hands in her lap. She didn't know what to say to that exactly, not because it wasn't true, but because it was the kind of true thing that, when said out loud, pressed on something she'd spent a long time keeping carefully arranged. "It is real," she said. "It's what's paying for my mother's prescriptions." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She stood up after a moment, smoothing her apron. "I'm going to get you more toast," she said. "You haven't touched the first round." "Emma." His voice was even, but it stopped her. She turned. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her the morning he told her about Ruth. Not measuring, not evaluating, something older and more direct. "I think you should apply," he said. She knew immediately what he meant. Landon, I'm not going to do anything weird, he said quickly, like he'd anticipated the specific shape of her objection. I'm not offering to pay for it. I'm saying I think you should apply for financial aid, every scholarship that exists, every grant program, every option. And I know someone who runs a foundation that specifically funds non-traditional nursing students, people who've deferred for caregiving reasons. And I could... He stopped. I could make an introduction, that's all. Just an introduction. Emma stood very still. She had spent so long pushing against the stone of this particular problem that the idea of a door in it felt almost suspicious, the way it does when you've been told no in 100 different ways, and suddenly someone says, maybe. That's not nothing, she said. The phrase came back to her from months ago, from his own mouth. He'd said it about her obstacles. She meant it now about what he was offering. No, he said. It's not. She thought about the spiral notebook, her mother's reading glasses, the Tuesday afternoons and the prerequisite chapters. Okay, she said. Something settled in his expression. Not triumph, relief, maybe. The specific relief of someone who's been waiting for permission to help with something that mattered. Okay, he said. She got him the toast. Send. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he ran the Marsh Family Foundation out of an office on the 14th floor of a building downtown that looked like money without being obvious about it. Emma wore the blazer she owned, the navy one she'd bought for a job interview 4 years ago and had worn twice since, and she carried a folder with everything she'd spent 3 weeks assembling: transcripts, letters of recommendation, a personal statement she'd rewritten 11 times until she stopped hearing her own editing voice in it and started hearing something that was actually hers. Landon had made the introduction by email. He had not come with her. She told him she didn't want him there, and he'd agreed immediately, which she appreciated. He understood the difference between a door and a hand to hold through it. Gerald Marsh was 60, with the kind of efficient warmth that came from decades of deciding quickly whether a person was serious. He had read her file before she sat down. She could tell from the way he referenced it without looking at it. And he asked her 3 questions that were not the questions she'd prepared for. Why nursing? He asked. Not generally. Specifically, why not something else that would also be in service of people and less expensive to pursue? Emma had thought about this enough that the answer came without performance. Because I want to be in the room, she said, when things are happening, not coordinating from outside it. I want to be the person who's actually there. He nodded, wrote something. Your mother's condition, he said. Does it factor into the nursing interest, or is it separate? Both, she said honestly. It's both. I won't pretend otherwise. He looked at her directly. That's not disqualifying. It's often the people who've been on the other side of a hospital bed who understand what the work actually asks of you. He wrote something else. What happens to her care if you're in school full-time? Emma had run this calculation so many times it lived in her chest. There's a home health aid program through the county that she qualifies for 3 days a week. My neighbor, Mrs. Park, she's retired and she checks in. My schedule would need to be managed carefully, but it's workable. She paused. It has to be workable, so I've made it workable. Gerald Marsh looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. How do you know Landon Pierce? He asked. It wasn't a suspicious question, curious. He's a regular at the diner where I work, Emma said. Gerald seemed to find this either amusing or meaningful, or perhaps both. Of course he is, he said, in a tone that suggested Landon Pierce doing something that made no obvious sense from the outside was not a new phenomenon in Gerald's experience. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. She was in the elevator going down before she let herself exhale fully. Her phone showed a text from booth 4. How'd it go? She typed, I don't know yet, but I think okay. His response? You were prepared. That matters. She put her phone in her bag and stepped out onto the sidewalk into the April afternoon, the city going about its ordinary business all around her, and stood there for a moment in the mild light. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't anything yet, but it was the first time in 2 years that the wall she'd been pressing against had shown any give at all. And that feeling, cautious, tentative, almost afraid to be believed, was something she had to be careful with. Hope at this stage was delicate. You couldn't grab it. You had to let it settle. May came, and with it, a particular Tuesday that Emma would remember in detail for a long time afterward. She was on the early shift. The diner was midway through its morning rush, but not the Friday level, but busy enough that she was moving fast, navigating between tables with the particular economy of motion she'd developed over 3 years that let her carry 4 things and take 2 orders at the same time without anything being done badly. She was at the counter when the door opened and a woman came in. Mid-50s, well-dressed in a quiet way. The kind of clothes that were expensive without being showy, with the precise posture of someone accustomed to walking into rooms that paid attention. She sat at the counter, which was unusual for that type. The counter stools were worn and not particularly comfortable, and most people who came in dressed like that chose the tables. She set her bag down and looked at the menu, which was laminated and had a coffee stain on the corner that nobody had been able to fully remove. Emma came over. "Coffee?" "Please," the woman said. "Black." Emma poured it and set it down. The woman looked at the diner with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not disdain, not nostalgia. Something more specific, like she was looking for something she expected to find and was checking to see if it was there. "Is this Patty's Corner Diner?" she asked, though the sign outside was clear enough. "Yes, ma'am," Emma said. "How long has it been here?" "Over 20 years," Emma said. "Patty's owned it that whole time." The woman nodded slowly. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, and Emma noticed with a slight jolt that it was the same gesture. Exact same. 2 hands, same angle. "Does a man come in here?" the woman said. 30s, dark hair, comes in every morning, always sits. "Booth 4, Emma said. The woman looked at her. "Yes. He's a regular," Emma said carefully. "Is there something I can help you with?" The woman studied her for a moment with a look that was evaluative in the same way Landon's was, which meant it was probably genetic. "I'm Diana," the woman said. "Landon's sister." Emma felt the pieces assemble quickly. "He mentioned you found some things in storage," she said. "Recently." Diana's expression shifted. "He told you about that?" "He told me about the aprons," Emma said. "The rubber band." Diana was quiet for a moment, and when she looked back at Emma, something had changed in her face. The assessment completed, maybe, the question answered. "She used to talk about this place," Diana said. "Or places like it?" She'd describe the smell, burnt coffee and something fried, and say it was one of her favorite smells because it meant she was at work, which meant they were going to be okay. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I don't know what it is about Landon that made him end up in a place that smells exactly like that." "He said it reminded him of May's," Emma said, "where your mother worked." "He said that to you," Diana said. Not a question, more like she was placing it somewhere. "We've talked a fair amount," Emma said, honestly. Diana looked at her with the same expression Landon wore when he was filing something away somewhere important. "He doesn't talk to people," she said. "Generally. He's very private." "I know," Emma said. She hadn't thought about it in those terms before, but she knew it was true. In 15 months, she had accumulated more of Landon Pierce than, she suspected, most people who'd known him far longer. "He talks to you," Diana said. Emma didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which Diana seemed to find acceptable. Diana drank her coffee, asked for a piece of toast, which Emma brought with butter on the side without thinking, and sat at the counter for 20 minutes looking at the diner in that searching, particular way. When she left, she pressed Emma's hand briefly, not a handshake, something more direct than that, and said, "Take care of him. He's not as fine as he looks." Emma stood at the counter after the door closed and thought about what that meant, turning it over the way you turn a stone to see the underside. She was still thinking about it when her phone buzzed that afternoon. Gerald Marsh's office. She stepped into the back hallway and answered. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. She stood with her back against the wall and her free hand flat against the cool concrete and listened. And by the end of it, her eyes were doing the thing she'd prevented them from doing in Landon's booth on a rainy November morning, and this time she didn't try to stop them. Partial scholarship. Federal loan package. A work-study arrangement that the foundation was willing to help structure around her mother's care schedule. It wasn't everything, It still required the loans, it still required careful management, it still required the kind of precise logistical planning that left no room for error. But it was possible. For the first time in 2 years, nursing school was not a thing she was keeping warm in the dark. It was a thing that could actually happen. She stood in the hallway for a full minute after she hung up. She could hear the diner on the other side of the wall, the coffee machine, Marcus in the kitchen, someone laughing at a table near the window. The ordinary noise of the place that had kept her afloat while she waited for this. She sent one text. Not to Carol. She'd call Carol on her break. She'd sit with that properly. But one text first, to booth 4. Gerald Marsh's office called. 3 dots. Then, and? She typed, "It's going to work." The response took longer than usual, long enough that she was about to put her phone away. Then, "I know it would." And then, after another pause, shorter, "Ruth would have liked you." Emma read that sentence 3 times. She pressed her back harder against the cool wall and breathed through her nose and let herself have the 30 seconds it required there in the hallway that smelled like coffee and old grease and something fried, and felt the weight of everything it meant. What this man had been carrying for 20-some years, what his mother had carried before him, what Emma herself had been carrying, and how sometimes the things that are heaviest for a person to hold are also the things that turn out to be the ones most worth holding. She put her phone in her apron pocket and went back out to her tables. She enrolled in June. Classes started in September. The weeks in between had a particular quality that Emma hadn't experienced in a long time. Not relaxed, because nothing about her life allowed for that, but purposeful in a way that felt different from simply enduring. She was doing the financial planning, working out the schedule with the county aid program, having the conversations with Carol that were difficult and necessary and ultimately okay. Carol had cried, which Carol never did in front of Emma, and then had been brisk and practical about it in a way that was the most Carol thing possible. "You should have done this 2 years ago," Carol said, which was her way of saying she was sorry it had taken this long, and she wished it hadn't, and she was also completely, unconditionally behind it. "I'm doing it now," Emma said. "Yes, you are," Carol said. And that was that. Landon had not made a big thing of his role in any of it, which Emma had expected and appreciated. He'd sent the email. He'd made the introduction. He'd said once, with that characteristic directness of his, "You did the rest." And then he'd moved on from it, because he was not the kind of person who needed to be thanked repeatedly for a thing he'd done because it was the right thing to do. But she'd noticed a difference in him. Subtle. The way most things about Landon were subtle. But there, he seemed less careful in the mornings. Not reckless. Nothing so dramatic. Just less like a man monitoring his own perimeter. He laughed more easily. Lily, who noticed everything and commented on most of it, had told Emma one Friday in July that her dad had been in a better mood lately, and she thought it was because he'd been sleeping more, which was possibly true and also possibly not the whole answer. "He smiles more," Lily told Emma, with the gravity of a scientist reporting data. "That's good," Emma said. "He smiles a lot when he's talking to you," Lily said, in the same informational tone. Emma looked at the child. Lily looked back at her with the specific innocence of someone who is absolutely aware of exactly what they are doing. "Hot chocolate?" Emma said. "With the marshmallows on the side," Lily confirmed, and climbed into booth 4. It was August when it finally became undeniable, and it happened in the way that the most honest things between two people usually happen, not with a scene or a declaration, but in a quiet moment that carried more weight than all the moments around it. The diner had been close to empty. A Thursday, late morning, the tail end of the rush. Landon had stayed longer than usual, the first time Emma could remember him doing that, and she'd found herself coming back to his booth more often than refills strictly required. She'd sat down across from him at some point. She couldn't remember the exact moment she'd decided to. And they'd talked, actually talked, the way they'd been building toward for a long time without naming it. About Lily, about the fall school year, about a trip Landon was considering, somewhere coastal, where Lily could see fish in their natural habitat for the good of her future documentary career. About Emma's first semester, the schedule she'd worked out, the particular terror and exhilaration of beginning something she'd been postponing for 2 years. "Are you scared?" he asked. Completely, she said. Yes. Good, he said. She looked at him. If you weren't scared, it wouldn't mean enough, he said. Fear is just proof that it matters. She thought about that. Your mother tell you that? He considered it. Probably, he said. She had a lot of things like that. Small instructions that didn't seem like instructions. Emma nodded. She looked at him across the booth. The dark circles, the honest face, the man who came in every morning at 7:15 and sat in the cracked vinyl seat and left $10 and had for 7 years been quietly honoring the woman who raised him while also being, without intending it, the kind of person who changed the shape of another person's life. She thought about Diana's hand on hers. He's not as fine as he looks. She thought about the way he'd sat at 4 in the morning with a feverish child who was calling for her mother, holding on until she stopped. She thought about all the things she'd come to know about him that added up not to a picture of a successful man, but to a picture of a person. Imperfect and tired and trying, the same as everyone, except with this particular commitment at the center of him that he'd made to a dead woman and kept without fail every single morning. She didn't say any of what she was thinking. They sat there in the quiet diner and the summer light came through the window at the angle it did in August, lower and more golden than July. And outside on Aldrich Street the trees moved slightly in a breeze that didn't reach inside. After a while, Landon said, "I'll be here tomorrow." "I know," Emma said. She stood up, smoothed her apron. "Same order?" she asked. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite the old measuring look, and wasn't quite the almost smile, but had elements of both, and something else she was only beginning to have words for. "Same order," he said. She went to get the coffee pot, and on the table, the $10 bills sat flat and still, the same as always, the same as it had been from the beginning, faithful and quiet and carrying more meaning than a piece of paper had any right to carry. But then, that was what a promise looked like. Not the moment you made it, the 10,000th morning you kept it. September arrived the way it always did in that city, with the first real suggestion that summer had been a temporary arrangement, the mornings carrying a chill that the afternoons were no longer strong enough to fully correct. The trees on Aldrich Street hadn't turned yet, but they looked like they were thinking about it, the green going slightly dull at the edges, preparing for what came next. Emma started nursing school on a Wednesday. She'd been awake at 5, which wasn't unusual, but the quality of the wakefulness was different from the pre-shift alertness she'd trained her body into over 3 years. This was nervous, the productive kind, the kind that made her check her bag 3 times and then check it again. Syllabi printed, pens. The spiral notebook, a new one, not the drugstore $1.49, but a proper one with section dividers, because she was doing this properly. Carol was already in the kitchen when Emma came out. This was unusual. Carol typically didn't surface until 7, and it was barely past 5:30. She had the coffee going and was standing at the counter in her robe, and when Emma came in, she turned and looked at her daughter in the way that parents look at children on significant mornings, the look that contains too many things to fit into an expression but tries anyway. "You didn't have to get up," Emma said. "I know I didn't have to," Carol said. She poured Emma a cup of coffee and set it on the table and sat down across from her, and they drank their coffee together in the early morning quiet, the kind of quiet that had been between them for 30 years and required nothing added to it. "Your father would have been proud," Carol said eventually. Emma looked at her cup, Her father was a complicated subject, a man she'd stopped expecting things from early enough that the wound had scarred over into something she didn't often touch. She wasn't sure pride from him was the thing she wanted, but she understood what Carol meant by saying it. "You would have been fine without me going," Emma said. "Just so you know. I was fine here." "I know you were fine here," Carol said. "That's not the point." She set her cup down. "The point is that you're more than fine, and fine isn't enough for you." Emma didn't say anything. "Go," Carol said. "You're going to be late if you sit here agreeing with me much longer." Emma almost laughed. She picked up her bag and kissed her mother on the top of the head, which she hadn't done since she was a teenager, and Carol reached up and briefly gripped her hand, and that was all of it, the whole send-off, practical and sufficient and full of everything that didn't need words. She was at the diner by 6:15, old habit, even on a day her shift didn't start until afternoon. She wasn't working the morning rush, had arranged her schedule to keep the afternoon and weekend shifts that worked around her classes, but she'd come in anyway. She told herself it was to help with the setup, and that was partly true. Landon was in booth 4 at 7:15, same as every morning, the cracked vinyl seat and the wobbly table and the cup of black coffee that she set down in front of him. "First day," he said. Not a question. "First day," she confirmed. He looked at her for a moment, unhurried, the way he looked at things that mattered. "How are you feeling?" "Like I might be sick," she said honestly. "That tracks," he said. She sat down across from him without deciding to. Patty was in the back. The morning was quiet enough. "My mother started at her first diner on a Wednesday," Landon said. "She always said Wednesdays were the best day to start something. Not Monday, because everyone's dreading Monday, and not the middle of the week where you're just trying to get through. Wednesday, you're far enough in that you're committed." "Is that true?" Emma said. Or did she say it to make herself feel better about not starting on a Monday? Landon considered this. "Probably the second one," he said, but she was right anyway. Emma looked at him across the table and thought, not for the first time and with less surprise than she'd once had, that she had no idea what she would have done without these mornings. Not because he'd fixed anything, but he hadn't, not really. The scholarship was a door he'd opened, but she'd walked through it herself. The studying was hers. The decision was hers. What he'd given her was something harder to name, the specific experience of being known by someone who wasn't obligated to know her, who had chosen to pay attention, who had taken her seriously without requiring anything from her in exchange for that seriousness. That was rarer than money. She understood that now. "You'll be good at this," he said. He wasn't performing encouragement. He was stating a thing he'd concluded. "I haven't done anything yet," she said. "No," he said, "but I've watched you do your job for 16 months. You pay attention to people. You notice what they need before they ask. You don't talk when they need quiet, and you don't go quiet when they need to be heard." He picked up his coffee. "That's most of nursing." Emma looked at her hands in her lap. She was aware that her face was doing something she didn't entirely have control over. "Toast is getting cold," she said. "I know," he said. He was almost smiling. She got up and went back behind the counter. And behind her on the table in booth 4, the $10 bill was already there. He'd put it down when she wasn't looking, same as always. The first semester was hard in the way she'd expected and difficult in the ways she hadn't. The coursework itself was manageable. Hard, but the kind of hard that had a shape to it, that responded to effort, that gave you back something for what you put in. Anatomy and physiology, fundamentals of nursing practice, a clinical rotation that began in October and occupied every Saturday morning from 7 to 1. She was tired in a way that was different from diner tired, less physical and more cognitive. The end-of-day emptiness of a brain that had been running at full capacity for 16 hours. But it was the context switching that cost her the most. The shift from the diner, where her value was measured in speed and attentiveness and the ability to carry 4 things without spilling anything, to the classroom, where she was the oldest person in most of her sections by 4 years and was acutely aware of it in a way she hadn't anticipated. The other students were younger and faster with the digital tools and had, most of them, come straight from pre-med or health science tracks without the interruption of real life in between. They were not unkind, but they existed in a different register. Their hard things were different hard things, and she sometimes felt in the middle of a study group that was complaining about weekend plans disrupted by exam prep that she was watching the situation from a slight remove, unable to fully step into the frame. She mentioned this once to Landon, on a slow Friday when Lily was in the booth beside him and occupied with drawing something elaborate on the paper placemat and could be trusted not to listen for 4 minutes. "The other students," Emma said, keeping her voice low out of habit. "I feel like I'm 20 years older than I am." Landon looked at her. "What does that actually mean for you, concretely?" Emma thought about it. "It means I think about different things. When we're in clinical rotation and we're practicing patient intake, they're thinking about doing it right, following the protocol correctly, and I'm thinking about the person in the bed, what they're scared of, whether their family knows to come." Landon was quiet for a moment. "That's not a problem," he said. I know it's not a problem, she said. It just makes me feel like I'm in the wrong conversation. You're not in the wrong conversation, he said. You're just already further along than they are. That's not comfortable. It's also not a problem. Lily looked up from the placemat without warning. Are you talking about school? She asked Emma. Yes, Emma said. I hate when people are mean at school, Lily said with conviction. Nobody's being mean, Emma said. But you look like how I look when someone's being mean, Lily said, with the diagnostic accuracy that 7-year-olds occasionally deployed like a scalpel. Emma looked at Landon. She does that, he said. I see, Emma said. Lily went back to her drawing. It appeared to be an anglerfish of considerable ambition. October settled in with the seriousness that month always brought. The leaves finally making good on their August threats, the city going amber and rust, and the particular gold that lasted about 10 days before the wind took it. Emma had her first major clinical evaluation in the second week of October, a practical assessment in a simulated patient scenario that counted for 30% of her fundamentals grade. She didn't sleep well the night before. She lay in the dark and ran through the protocol in her head: assessment, vitals, documentation, communication standards, and then lay there some more, and at some point Carol knocked softly on the door. You're awake, Carol said. It wasn't a question. Go back to sleep, Emma said. I'm not tired, Carol said, which was at least partly true. Her medication sometimes disrupted her sleep in both directions, too much and too little in no predictable pattern. She came in and sat on the edge of the bed the way she'd done when Emma was a child and couldn't sleep, and they sat there in the dark together, which was enough. Tell me something, Carol said. Not about tomorrow. Something else. Emma thought about it. Lily Pierce, the little girl, you've heard me mention her. She's decided her YouTube channel needs a theme song. She asked me if I could sing. Can you? Not even slightly, Emma said. Carol laughed in the dark. It was a good sound. Emma closed her eyes. She's a good kid, she said. She reminds me of someone who hasn't been hurt yet but isn't naive about the world either. Like she already understands that things are hard sometimes and she's decided to be loud and curious about it anyway. Carol was quiet for a moment. Sounds like someone I know, she said. Emma opened her eyes. At 7, Carol said. Before you had reasons to be careful. Emma lay there thinking about that for a while. Get some sleep, Carol said, and stood up and went back to her room. Emma fell asleep 20 minutes later, and when her alarm went off, she felt, if not rested, at least ready, which was close enough. She passed the evaluation. Not perfectly. She missed a documentation step that the assessor caught and noted with the particular gentle precision that good clinical instructors used, neither making it larger than it was, nor letting it go unaddressed. Emma wrote the note in her margin and went over it 3 times that evening and did not make the same mistake in any subsequent assessment. She texted Landon that she'd passed. His response was, of course. And then, Lily wants to know if you'll come to her school's fall festival Saturday. She's been asking me for 2 weeks, and I kept forgetting to ask, which is a problem she's about to tell you directly if I don't get there first. Emma stared at that message. The fall festival. A school event. Something that was, in the clear plain reading of it, a step outside the perimeter they'd been carefully existing within for 16 months. The diner, the texts about Lily and nursing school, the mornings that had accumulated into something neither of them had named because naming it might disrupt the arrangement, and the arrangement was, whatever else it was, working. She typed, "What time?" His response came fast. 10. She'll want you to look at her project. It's about anglerfish. Prepare yourself. Emma looked at her phone for a long moment. Then, tell her I'll be there. Bam. The fall festival occupied the gymnasium and 3 adjacent classrooms of Lily's school, and it smelled like poster paint and the particular sugar and stress combination of children who had been working toward a public presentation and were now, collectively, vibrating with nervous energy. Lily spotted Emma from across the gym before Emma had fully gotten through the door, and the response was immediate and physical. A 7-year-old at full sprint, pigtails and all, who had no concerns whatsoever about whether it was appropriate to run in a gymnasium. "You came," Lily said, arriving at speed and stopping just short of full collision. "I came," Emma confirmed. Lily grabbed her hand and pulled, which was simply something that happened, and Emma let herself be led across the gymnasium to a table in the second row that had a trifold poster board covered in photographs of deep-sea creatures and hand-lettered facts in the uneven, confident print of a child who had opinions about font size. "This is my project," Lily announced. "Episode 3 of Fish with Lily is going to use all of this as research material." "This is incredible," Emma said, and meant it. The level of detail was genuinely impressive. There were diagrams. There were Latin names spelled with varying degrees of accuracy. There was a hand-drawn anglerfish in the center that bore a remarkable resemblance to the one from the diner placemat. "I did all the research myself," Lily said. "Dad helped me print the pictures, but the words are all mine." "The words are very good," Emma said. Landon arrived behind Lily at a pace that suggested he'd been on the other side of the gym and had walked, not run, which was a choice that said something about him. He was wearing, for the first time Emma could recall, something that was not a button-down, a simple dark sweater, and he looked, she thought, slightly less like a man bracing for something. "She found you fast," he said. "She's fast in general," Emma said. "We've established that," he said. They stood beside each other at Lily's project table and listened to Lily deliver what amounted to a complete presentation. She'd clearly given it multiple times already and had refined her delivery through iteration, pausing for effect, asking rhetorical questions, gesturing at the diagrams with appropriate authority. 2 other children drifted over during the middle of it and got absorbed into the audience, which Lily accepted as her due. Emma watched Landon watching his daughter. It was the expression she'd tried to name many times, the exhaustion and the helpless love, but today there was something else in it. Something easier, like a man who had, in some way she didn't have full information about, stopped expecting himself to do this alone. "She's gonna be something," Emma said quietly. "Yeah," Landon said, equally quiet. "She already is." They were standing close enough together that she was aware of the few inches of space between them in the particular way you become aware of space that could close. Neither of them closed it, but neither of them moved away from it either. What? November came, and with it the anniversary. 1 year since the rainy morning in the booth when Landon had said, "You still want to know about the $10, and Emma had sat down across from him, and he had told her about Ruth, about December, about soup stretched with water, and a man who left $10 every morning until it wasn't needed anymore. She thought about that on the morning of, which was a Saturday, and she was in clinical rotation, and she was assessing a woman in bed 7 who was 73 and had been in the hospital for 6 days following a fall, and who was scared in the way that people are scared when a body they've trusted their whole life has surprised them badly. Emma did her assessment, vitals, documentation, everything by protocol, the missed step from October not appearing again. But she also sat on the edge of the bed for 4 minutes after, which was technically not in the schedule, and she talked to the woman. Asked about her family, who was coming to visit, what she was most looking forward to when she went home. The woman's name was Dorothy, and she had a daughter in Portland who was flying in tomorrow, and she had a garden she was worried about because the neighbor who'd been watering it hadn't been reliable, and her tomatoes were probably done for. "Tell me about the garden," Emma said. Dorothy's whole face changed. Emma sat there for 4 minutes and listened to everything about that garden, and then she squeezed Dorothy's hand and said she'd check back before the end of her shift, and she went out to the hallway and stood there for a moment with her clipboard against her chest. Her supervising instructor was a woman named Helen Castillo, 45, had been a working nurse for 20 years before moving to clinical instruction, with the kind of practical authority that came from having seen enough to not be rattled by most things. She'd been watching from the hallway. "You know that wasn't in the protocol," Helen said. "I know," Emma said. Helen looked at her for a moment. "The documentation was clean this rotation." "Thank you." "I'm not complimenting the documentation," Helen said. "I'm saying you did the thing right and then you did the other thing right, and those are different skills, and most people develop one before the other." She looked down at her own clipboard. "Good rotation, Collins." It was not an effusive compliment. Helen Castillo did not do effusive, but Emma carried it with her for the rest of the shift and into the evening. She called Landon from the parking lot of the hospital. She didn't know exactly why she called instead of texting, only that it was November, and it was the anniversary of a thing that had mattered, and she wanted to hear his voice. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. A pause. "Good rotation?" "Really good rotation," she said. "I sat with a patient for 4 minutes that weren't in the protocol." "Was she okay?" "She's scared," Emma said. "But she has a garden and she talked about it, and for 4 minutes she wasn't scared. So, yeah, she was okay." Landon was quiet for a moment. Ruth used to say the most important part of the job wasn't what you did for people. It was what you let them feel while you were doing it. Emma stood in the parking lot in the November evening, the air cold and clean, and felt something settle in her that had been slightly unsettled for a long time. Not fixed. Things weren't fixed. They were managed, tended, adjusted, but settled. "It's been a year," she said, "since you told me about the $10. "I know," he said, and she could hear in those 2 words that he'd known this morning, had probably thought about it the same way she had. "Your mother would have been proud of you," Emma said. She hadn't planned to say it, but it was true, and it was November and the parking lot was empty, and it seemed like the right time for true things. The silence that followed was longer than usual. When he spoke, his voice had the quality she'd heard only a few times. Unguarded, the careful management set aside. "Thank you," he said. They stayed on the phone without talking for another minute, which should have been awkward and wasn't. And then he said Lily was asking for dinner and he needed to go, and Emma said of course, and they hung up. She sat in her car for a moment. Through the hospital's glass front, she could see the lights of the wards, floors of them, and the small movements of people doing their work in the early evening. In 6 months, she'd be doing her advanced rotations. In 14 months, she'd be done. She started the car and drove home. Winter came back like it always did, unfussy and thorough, and the diner on Aldrich Street put up the same paper snowflakes in the window that it put up every year, slightly more ragged than the year before, Patty refusing to replace them on principle. Landon and Emma had been, for 3 months, doing something that neither of them had titled. It had begun with the Fall Festival, continued with a Saturday afternoon in late October when Lily had been at a classmate's birthday party, and Landon had appeared at the diner at 2 in the afternoon. Not his usual time, not in booth 4 at the counter, and asked Emma if she wanted to walk, because the afternoon was decent and he'd been inside all day. They'd walked for an hour and 15 minutes along the river path 2 blocks from Aldrich Street. They'd talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they're getting used to each other outside the context they've always occupied. It was slightly different, being with him in the open air without an apron and a coffee pot. Not worse, just new. He'd taken her hand somewhere around the 40-minute mark. Not dramatically. It was a bridge crossing, slightly uneven pavement, and he'd reached over and she'd let him, and they'd continued walking, and neither of them had commented on it. He'd walked her back to her car. "This was good," she said. "Yeah," he said. It was. He'd kissed her, briefly, which she'd been half expecting and half not, and it was the kind of kiss that asked a question more than it made a statement, and she'd answered it by not pulling back. And that had been that. She'd driven home and sat in the parking lot of her apartment building for a while. Not because she was troubled, but because she was the kind of person who needed to sit with things and feel their full weight before she moved on. She was not afraid of what this was. She was also not without her fears around it, which were specific and earned. He was a man with a child who'd lost her mother. He was a man who carried things carefully because he'd learned early that some things, dropped, didn't recover. And Emma herself was not uncomplicated. She had her mother's health as a permanent variable, her school as a consuming commitment, and her own long-trained self-sufficiency, which was a genuine character trait and also occasionally an obstacle. She had called Diana. This had surprised her in retrospect. She didn't know Diana well, had met her only once at the counter, but Diana had pressed her hand and said, "He's not as fine as he looks," and that had lodged in Emma in a way that felt like permission for a different kind of conversation. Diana had picked up immediately. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said, which was such a Landon family thing to say that Emma had almost laughed. "I don't know what I'm doing," Emma said. "Sure you do," Diana said. You're just not certain yet if it's wise. Is it? Diana was quiet for a moment. I'll tell you what I know, she said. He's a good person. He's a difficult person to get close to, not because he's closed off, but because he doesn't know how to accept things easily, and someone spent a long time leaving before he got used to that, and that's not repaired yet. He loves his daughter more than he knows what to do with. He takes promises seriously. And he's been different since he started going to that diner. A pause. Specifically since he started talking to you. Emma sat with all of that. That's a lot, she said. You asked, Diana said. Emma had laughed then. Genuinely, the kind that surprised you. I did, she said. He's worth it, Diana said, for what it's worth from his sister, who is deeply biased. It's worth something, Emma said. Thank you. She'd gone inside and made Carol dinner and helped with medications, and sat on the couch with her mother watching television that neither of them was paying attention to, and by the end of the evening she'd stopped processing and started simply knowing, which was different. Christmas that year was quieter than usual and better for it. Emma worked the Christmas Eve morning shift because several people had called in and Patty needed the coverage, and Emma didn't mind, had never minded working holidays the way some people did. The diner was slow and warm, the snowflake decorations doing their job in the window light, and at 7:15 Landon walked in with Lily, who was wearing a sweater with reindeer on it and had opinions about the diner's Christmas decorations. The snowflakes are crooked, Lily told Emma. They're vintage, Emma said. Lily considered this. Is vintage just a nice word for old and kind of messed up? Often, Emma said. Okay, Lily said, as though this information had been filed appropriately. She climbed into booth 4. Hot chocolate, please. And can I do the marshmallows myself today? Emma brought out the hot chocolate and a small bowl with 6 marshmallows, because Lily would want to have choices, and watched Lily arrange them with the seriousness of an engineer. Landon watched Emma across the table. They hadn't made a thing of whatever they were. It existed in stolen hours, like the walks, 2 dinners at places that weren't the diner, evenings when Lily was at Diana's and Emma's clinical schedule allowed for actual time. Lily knew something was different without knowing the specifics, which Emma suspected was mostly because Lily was the kind of child who tracked changes in her father's atmosphere the way some children tracked weather. She'd asked Emma once, at the booth, without looking up from whatever she was drawing, "Do you like my dad?" Emma had managed a very neutral, "Your dad's a good person." Lily had looked up. "That's not what I asked." Emma had looked helplessly at Landon, who had been intensely interested in his toast. "Yes," Emma had said. Lily had nodded and gone back to drawing. "Okay," she said, and then, after a moment, "He likes you too. He thinks you're really brave." Landon had cleared his throat. Lily was impervious. On Christmas Eve, with the snowflakes crooked in the window and Lily engineering marshmallow arrangements, Landon looked at Emma across booth 4 with the expression she'd been collecting for 16 months and still couldn't fully translate, only knew the weight of it, and said quietly enough that Lily wouldn't catch it. "How's your mother?" "Good," Emma said. "New medication is working better. She's been cooking again." "That's good," he said. "She made her pozole," Emma said. "First time in 2 years. I may have cried about it in the kitchen." He looked at her. "Reasonable response," he said. "I thought so," she said. Lily looked up from her marshmallow arrangement. "Is pozole the soup thing?" "Yes," Emma said. "Can I have some sometime?" Lily asked. "Lily," Landon said. "What?" "I'm asking politely." "You can ask Emma directly if that's something she's comfortable with," Landon said, in the tone of a parent navigating the collision of his child's social enthusiasm with the actual human agency of the person being enthusiastically invited to things. Emma looked at Lily's expectant face. "I'll ask my mom," she said. "She'd probably love to make it for someone who'd appreciate it." Lily looked satisfied in the way of someone whose plan has proceeded exactly as intended. Landon looked at Emma with an expression that was, she had finally decided after 16 months, as close to helpless joy as that particular face could manage. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be," Emma said. She poured his coffee. It was Christmas Eve, and the diner smelled like burnt coffee and old grease and something slightly sweet from the holiday muffins Patty had made and put out on the counter. And Lily Pierce was putting 6 marshmallows in her hot chocolate with the focus of a person doing important work. And outside on Aldrich Street, the trees were bare and still under a low gray sky. Emma stood at the edge of booth 4 and thought about everything that had happened in 16 months and everything that was still in the process of becoming something. And she thought about Ruth in her storage unit's rubber-banded aprons, and she thought about Dorothy's tomato garden, and she thought about her mother's pozole on the stove for the first time in 2 years. You couldn't plan for the things that changed you. You couldn't arrange for them or engineer them. They came the way that man had come to May's diner, quiet and consistent and asking nothing back. And they changed the shape of your life, and you spent the rest of it being grateful and trying to deserve the gift of having been changed. She picked up the coffee pot and refilled the cup, and Landon said thank you, same as every morning. And she said you're welcome, same as every morning. And the $10 bill was already on the table and would be tomorrow and the day after. Some things didn't change. That was not a limitation. That was the point. The new year came in without ceremony. Emma spent New Year's Eve at home with Carol, which was where she'd spent most New Year's Eve since her mother's diagnosis, and which she'd long since stopped thinking of as a sacrifice. They made soup, not pozole, just a simple chicken soup that Carol could manage standing at the stove for 20 minutes without tiring, and watched an old film that neither of them hadn't seen before. And at midnight they heard the neighbors through the wall doing something loud and celebratory, and Carol said, "Happy New Year, baby." And Emma said it back, and that was enough. She thought about Landon that evening, which was not unusual. She thought about him with the regularity of someone who has stopped fighting the fact that a person has become part of the furniture of their mind. He texted at 11:50. Lily is asleep, has been since 9:30. I'm watching her breathe like a person who has completely lost perspective. Emma had smiled at that in the dark of the living room. That's called being a parent, she'd typed back. Seems inefficient, he'd responded. Happy New Year, Landon. A pause. Then, Happy New Year, Emma. She'd put her phone down and listened to the neighbors and thought about the year ahead, which was the year she would finish nursing school and the year that whatever she and Landon were would either become something definite or would have to be looked at honestly. She was not afraid of either outcome, which was how she knew she'd changed in the past 17 months. She had been, for a long time, a person who managed risk by reducing her exposure to it. She'd been careful with hope because hope had costs. She'd been careful with people because people left or got sick or simply turned out to be different than you'd understood them to be. She was still careful. She didn't think that would change, but careful and closed were different things, and she'd been confusing them for years. January and February were hard months for Carol, not catastrophically. Nothing that required hospitalization, nothing that changed the fundamental picture. But the cold made certain symptoms worse. And there was a 2-week period in February when Emma came home every day to find her mother more fatigued than the day before. The light in her eyes a little dimmer, the effort of ordinary things showing more plainly on her face. Emma adjusted the schedule, picked up what needed picking up, cooked more, talked less, and sat with her mother in the evenings with the particular quality of attention that said, I see you, and I'm not going anywhere without requiring it to be said out loud. She missed 2 study sessions. She caught up on the weekend. Helen Castillo, reviewing her clinical hours, noted the slight compression in her schedule with the observational precision that characterized everything she did. Personal obligations? Helen asked. My mother, Emma said. It's managed. Helen looked at her for a moment. Collins, she said, when it's not managed, when there's a week where it's not manageable, tell me before it becomes a problem, and we'll work around it. Don't be a martyr about this. It doesn't help anyone. Yes, Emma said. That's an instruction, Helen said, not a suggestion. I understand, Emma said. She did understand. She also knew that her instinct to handle things herself without asking for adjustment was so deeply trained that understanding it intellectually and actually doing otherwise were 2 different achievements. She was working on the distance between them. Landon noticed the compressed February in the way he noticed most things. Quietly, without making it a thing, but with a precision that had stopped surprising her. He didn't offer solutions. He asked, on a slow Thursday, when she looked like what she was, which was a person running on the thinner end of her reserves, "What do you actually need right now? Not what can I do? Not let me help. What do you actually need?" Emma thought about it genuinely, which the question deserved. "I need someone to not make this bigger than it is," she said. "It's hard. It's not a crisis. I need it to just be hard for a while without anyone treating it like something to fix." He nodded. "Okay," he said. And that was all. He didn't fix it. He let it be hard, and he was there while it was, and somehow that was the most useful thing anyone could have done. She thought about that later, about the difference between presence and intervention. Ruth had understood it. The man at May's diner hadn't tried to solve Ruth's problems. He'd just shown up every morning and left something that said, "I see that you're here and you matter." And somehow that had been enough to keep a woman going through her hardest winter. Emma was beginning to understand this not as a story about money or generosity, but as a story about witness, about the specific human need to be seen by someone who has no obligation to see you. March arrived, and with it the beginning of Emma's final semester. The last stretch of nursing school had a different quality than what had come before. More clinical hours, less classroom. The real thing closer and therefore more urgent in both directions, more exciting and more terrifying. She was on rotation at a different hospital now, a larger one, and the cases were more complex and the pace was faster, and she discovered, good at the pace. The thing Landon had said about her in September, "You notice what people need before they ask," turned out to be true in clinical settings in a way that her instructors mentioned with enough frequency that she stopped being surprised by it and started understanding it as simply part of how she worked. She was not the best student in her cohort at the technical protocols. There were 3 people ahead of her on pure procedural accuracy, and she had made peace with that. But she had been told twice by Helen Castillo and once by a supervising physician named Dr. Reyes, who said things plainly, the person patients asked for when they had a choice. The person who got called when a family member was frightened and needed someone to sit with them and translate what was happening in the room into language that could be absorbed. "You have a gift for being in the room," Dr. Reyes told her once, between rotations, in the hallway outside room 14 where an elderly man had just learned something difficult about his prognosis. "Not everyone has it. Some people develop it. Some people never get there. You came in with it." Emma thought about that for a long time. She thought about the diner and its cracked vinyl and bad coffee, about 3 years of learning to read what a table needed before they flagged her, about her mother and the long practice of communicating in the register below words, about Dorothy and her tomato garden. You didn't come by that kind of skill in a classroom. You came by it by paying attention to people when it would have been easier not to. She told Landon about Dr. Reyes's comment on a Friday in March, the kind of Friday where Lily was in the booth but was uncharacteristically quiet, working through a chapter book with focused intensity, and so the adults were able to actually talk without managing the conversational traffic. "The physician said that?" Landon asked. "Word for word," Emma said. He looked at his coffee cup. Something moved through his expression that she recognized now. He was pleased in the way that private people are pleased, not showing it large, but it was there. "Ruth had it too," he said. "She'd come home from a shift and tell me about the regulars, not the complaints or the difficult ones. She'd talk about the ones who seemed lonely or scared or like they needed something they didn't know how to ask for. She always knew." He paused. "She would have liked watching you work." Emma looked at him across the booth. It was the second time he'd said something like that. Ruth would have liked you. Ruth would have liked watching you work. And each time it landed differently. It was the closest thing to a declaration that a man like Landon Pierce made she'd come to understand. He didn't speak his feelings directly, not because he didn't have them, but because he'd learned early to be conservative with the things that mattered most, to hold them carefully rather than display them, to show love through consistency rather than announcement. She understood this because she was built similarly, and she understood it because it was also a limitation for both of them, the kind of armor that protected you and occasionally kept out the things you actually wanted. "Landon," she said. He looked at her. I need you to know something, she said. She'd thought about how to say this for a while, not the words exactly, but the intention behind them. This, she gestured between them, which was an imprecise gesture for a specific thing. Whatever this is, I'm not casual about it. I know neither of us is the kind of person who puts things into language easily. But I need you to know that I'm not treating this like something temporary. Something shifted in his face. The careful management, moving aside. I know that, he said. I need you to actually know it, she said. Not assume it. Know it. He was quiet for a moment. Lily turned a page. Outside, the March light was doing what March light did, trying its best and not quite getting there, but trying. I know it, he said, and the way he said it was different from the first time. Definite, like a person signing something. Emma nodded. She picked up the coffee pot. More? She said. Yeah, he said. She filled his cup, and Lily looked up from her book long enough to say, "Mine too, please," about the hot chocolate without looking away from the page, and Emma topped it off, and the morning continued. She graduated in May. The ceremony was at the university's main auditorium, which was slightly too warm for the number of people in it and had acoustics that made the speaker's remarks echo in a way that required active listening. Emma sat in the third row in her white uniform. The school used white for its pinning ceremony, traditional, which Emma had expected to feel like a costume and turned out to feel like something she'd been working toward long enough that it felt earned. Carol was in the audience. Emma had made sure of that first, before anything else. Wheelchair arranged, parking organized, the specific seat that would give Carol the best view without requiring her to manage the crowd. Carol had objected to the wheelchair on principle, and then conceded to it on practicality, which was Carol's typical negotiating trajectory. Diana was there. Emma hadn't expected that. Diana had texted 2 days before. Can I come? Landon said you probably wouldn't mind. Tell me if you mind. Emma had texted back, I don't mind. And then, because it was true, I'm glad. She looked for them before the ceremony started and found them in the third row from the back, which told her that Landon had been thoughtful about their position, far enough back that Lily could move without disrupting anyone, near enough to an aisle that exit was easy if needed. Carol was 3 rows in front of them, and Emma watched Landon lean forward and say something to Carol before sitting back, which Carol had apparently found agreeable, because she turned and nodded with an expression Emma would have liked to have seen more closely. What Landon had said to Carol, she found out later, was, "She's the hardest working person I've ever met. You did that." Carol had replied, "I know. She did it herself, but yes." Emma didn't know any of this during the ceremony. She sat in the third row in her white uniform and listened to the remarks and thought about 3 years of double shifts and deferred applications and the specific Tuesday afternoons at the kitchen table with a drugstore notebook, and about a man who'd walked into a diner with a cracked vinyl booth and left $10 on a table every morning and changed the direction of her life without intending to. She thought about Ruth. She thought about December and soup stretched with water, and an anonymous man who'd understood that what a struggling person sometimes needed was not rescue, but simple, consistent evidence that someone noticed they were there. She thought about Dorothy and her tomato garden, about the woman in room 7 who'd grabbed Emma's hand last week during a difficult procedure and held it with a grip that said she was afraid and she needed someone to stay, and Emma had stayed, and afterward the woman had said thank you for not leaving in a voice that carried more than the 4 words. This was what she was going to do. She was going to be in the room. She was going to stay. Helen Castillo's name was called before Emma's, and the assembled faculty and students applauded, and Helen accepted with her usual economical precision. When Emma Collins was called, she walked to the front and stood at the podium, and someone pinned the pin to her uniform, and someone else handed her the certificate, and she looked out at the audience. She found Carol first. Carol was not crying, which Emma had expected because Carol didn't cry in public on principle, but her face had the look it had on the morning she'd put her reading glasses on the drugstore notebook, full of the things that didn't fit into expressions but had to go somewhere. She found Landon. He was standing. The whole row was standing, which she only registered after a moment because she'd found his face first. Lily was beside him, also standing, waving both hands above her head in the way of a person with no ambivalence about how she felt about this moment, and Diana was next to them with her hand over her mouth. And then, because this was real life, and real life did not resolve itself cleanly, Emma's eyes filled in exactly the way she'd been preventing them from filling for approximately 20 months, right there at the front of the auditorium. And she did not stop it this time because it was graduation and she had earned every single tear and she was going to let them happen. She walked back to her seat and sat down, and a woman next to her, a classmate named Rosario, who had been Emma's study partner through the worst of the first semester, handed her a small packet of tissues without saying anything, which was the right call. After the ceremony, in the hallway, they found each other in the crowd. Lily reached Emma first, same as always, but this time, instead of grabbing her hand, she stopped in front of her and looked up at her with those serious eyes and said, "You look like a real nurse." "I am a real nurse," Emma said. Lily seemed to find this significant. She nodded slowly. "Episode 7, she said. "When I do the episode about medicine, you can be the expert." "I'll be there," Emma said. Carol arrived and Emma hugged her mother with the particular quality of hug that only exists between people who have stood beside each other in a long difficulty and come out the other side with something still intact. Carol was solid and warm and smelled like the lavender soap she'd used Emma's entire life, and Emma held on for a moment longer than necessary, and Carol let her. "Okay," Carol said finally. "Okay, you're getting my hair wet." Emma laughed and pulled back. Diana was next, and Diana did not say very much because Diana, like her brother, communicated most efficiently in brief, true things. She held Emma's arms and looked at her and said, "Welcome to the family," and then corrected herself. "I mean, I just meant, I know what you meant," Emma said. Diana looked mortified, and Emma squeezed her arm and moved on, because embarrassing Diana felt like something she could revisit at leisure later, now that apparently that was a thing she'd be able to do. Landon was last. He'd been standing back, letting the others get there first, which was so precisely him that she'd have predicted it if asked. When the small crowd rearranged itself and it was just the two of them for a moment, he looked at her in his particular way, not measuring anymore, hadn't been measuring in a long time, just looking at her. "How do you feel?" he said. "Terrified," she said. "And ready, both at the same time." He nodded. "That's correct," he said. He reached out and straightened the pin on her uniform slightly, which it didn't need, and she understood the gesture was not really about the pin. "Your mother was here today," Emma said quietly. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "She was." Ishtiya. 6 weeks after graduation, Emma started her first position as a registered nurse at the hospital where she'd done her advanced rotation. Floor 3, general medicine, the ward with Dorothy's type of case, the people navigating what it meant when the body revealed its limits. She was not new to difficult things. That helped. On her first day, Helen Castillo happened to be in the building for a meeting and passed Emma in the hallway and gave her the specific nod of someone who does not do excessive warmth, but whose nod means everything it means. She called Landon on her break. He picked up before the second ring. "How is it?" he said. "Exactly what I thought it would be," she said. "Harder and better and both at the same time." "Same as graduating," he said. "Same as graduating," she agreed. A pause, then, "Lily wants to know if you're coming Sunday." Sunday dinners had become a thing over the past few months, informal enough that nobody had made a formal thing of it, consistent enough that it had become something you arranged around. Emma and Carol, Landon and Lily, Diana sometimes. Carol's kitchen usually because Carol had opinions about other people's cooking that were easier to manage when she was in her own space. Lily had appointed herself sous chef on the grounds that she was the youngest and therefore the most trainable, which was a logic that Carol found acceptable. The first dinner that included both Carol and Lily in the same kitchen had been, objectively, slightly chaotic. Lily asked questions at a volume that Carol found stimulating and Emma found exhausting, and there had been a minor incident involving the pozole and a measurement that Lily had taken into her own hands. But by the end of it, Carol had been laughing, actually laughing, in a way Emma hadn't heard in 2 years, and Lily had announced that Carol was her favorite and that she was going to come back every Sunday, and Carol had said, "We'll see," in a tone that meant yes. "Tell her yes," Emma said. "Tell her I'm bringing dessert." "She'll want to approve the dessert selection in advance," Landon said. "I know," Emma said. "Tell her I'm bringing the chocolate thing." "The chocolate thing," he confirmed, as though this were a precise culinary term. "She'll accept that." Emma sat in the small break room on the third floor of the hospital and listened to the sounds of the ward through the half-open door and thought about Sunday. About Carol's kitchen with its slightly too small table that they added a leaf to now when everyone came. About Lily's dedicated corner of the counter where her prep station was. About Landon sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee while the room moved around him, less contained than he'd been when she first knew him, looser, more willing to be in the middle of things. "I'll be there," she said. The following Saturday was the kind of October day that the city produced occasionally, as though in apology for its winters, clear and sharp, the light at the angle that made everything look slightly more significant, the trees on Aldrich Street in their full amber and rust. Emma had the morning off. She'd walked to the diner anyway because some habits had roots deep enough that they weren't really habits anymore. They were just part of the structure. She sat at the counter with a cup of Patty's bad coffee, and Patty herself appeared from the back, which was unusual. Patty ran the back end most mornings and rarely surfaced without reason. She poured herself a cup and stood across the counter from Emma. "You're not working today," Patty said. "I know," Emma said. Patty looked at her for a moment. "You're a nurse now." "Yes." Patty nodded slowly. She had never been, in the years Emma had known her, the type to make declarations or offer sentiment. Her communication was almost entirely practical, and what warmth she had was expressed through action. The schedule adjustment that gave Emma her Tuesday afternoons, the way she'd never once questioned Emma's nursing school commitments, the Christmas muffins on the counter every year that she pretended were for the customers. "You were good here," Patty said. Emma looked at her. "I'm not good at saying things," Patty said, with the directness of someone who knows their limitation and is naming it rather than working around it. "But you were good here, and you're going to be good there, and that's what I wanted to say." Emma set down her coffee cup. "Thank you, Patty," she said. "For the Tuesdays." Patty looked briefly like she might deny knowing what Emma was referring to, and then didn't. "You needed them," she said, and went back to the kitchen. Emma sat at the counter and drank her bad coffee and looked at the diner. The snowflakes were down from last year, not yet replaced for this year, the windows clean and clear, the black and white floor Lily had once compared to a chessboard, the booths with their vinyl seats, booth 4 with its diagonal crack that nobody had ever fixed. She heard the door. 7:15. She didn't turn around right away. She listened to the bell and the footsteps and the particular sound of someone settling into a specific seat. Then Lily's voice. "Emma, you're not working. Why are you here?" Emma turned around. Lily was already climbing into booth 4, school bag over one shoulder, the kind of morning bright energy that 8-year-olds produce that seems to violate basic physics. Behind her, Landon stood at the entrance to the booth with his jacket over one arm, and he looked at Emma at the counter with an expression that had no components of the old, careful management left in it at all. She moved from the counter to booth 4. She sat down across from him, which was where she'd sat since a rainy November morning almost 2 years ago, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since before either of them had put language to what it meant. "You're not working," he said. "I know," she said. "You came anyway." "Apparently," she said. He almost smiled. She'd long since stopped cataloging the almost smiles, had started simply receiving them. Lily was arranging her school bag contents on the table for reasons that were unclear but clearly important to her, and the Tuesday couple came in for their shared pancakes, and Marcus could be heard in the kitchen, and the October light came through the window at its long, thoughtful angle. Landon reached into his wallet. She'd seen this motion so many times that she'd stopped registering it consciously, the way you stop registering the sound of your own refrigerator. But today she watched him. He took out the $10 bill, crisp, same as always, the bill prepared for this purpose, and he held it in his hand for a moment instead of putting it down. He looked at it. Emma watched his face. She knew what he was holding, not just the bill. The weight of 23 years of keeping a promise to a woman who'd stretched soup and worked nights and loved her children with more than she had. The weight of May's diner and a rubber band around a stack of aprons and a December that had been survived because one quiet person showed up every morning and left something behind that said, "You matter, and I see you." He set the bill on the table. Then he looked at Emma, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said that the morning hadn't already said. Lily looked up from her organizational project. "Hot chocolate," she announced, "with the marshmallows on the side. And Emma, can we go to the park after school today? Dad said maybe if you weren't working and the weather was good, which it is." Emma looked at Landon. He lifted one shoulder. "I said maybe." "I'm not working," Emma said, "and the weather is good." Lily made the sound of someone whose plan has proceeded exactly as intended. Emma got up to get the hot chocolate and the coffee and the toast with butter on the side, and she was behind the counter when Landon said her name, not loudly, just her name, the way you say someone's name when you want them to stop for a moment. She turned. He was looking at her from booth 4, and there was something in his expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the measuring look, not the almost smile, not the carefully managed private seriousness that had been his default face for as long as she'd known him. Something more direct than all of it. Something that had been accumulating for almost 2 years and had apparently decided that a Saturday in October in a diner on Aldrich Street with a cup of bad coffee and his daughter sorting colored pencils in the booth beside him was exactly the right time to arrive. "I need to tell you something," he said. Emma set down the coffee pot. Lily looked up. The Tuesday couple looked up. Even Patty, who had reappeared from the back for reasons of her own, seemed to have gone still. Landon reached into his jacket pocket. Emma's hand found the edge of the counter. What he put on the table was not the $10 bill. It was a small velvet box, dark navy, the kind that had a specific shape that meant a specific thing, and he set it down beside the existing $10 bill and looked at Emma across the diner with the most unguarded expression she'd ever seen on him, which was saying something because she had been collecting his expressions for almost 2 years and thought she'd seen most of what he had. "I know you didn't need me to do any of it," he said. "The introduction to Gerald, any of it. You'd have found your way. Landon, let me finish," he said. Not harshly. He just needed to say it without being interrupted. "You'd have found your way. That's not what this is about. This is about—" He stopped, pressed his lips together briefly, the tell that meant he was doing the thing where he picked the truest sentence from among the available options. "This is about the fact that watching you find your way was the most—" He stopped again. "I was not looking for this. I was not in a place where I was looking for this. And then you sat down across from me in this booth on a rainy November morning, and you listened to me tell you about my mother, and you didn't make it into something it wasn't, and I—" He let out a breath. "I don't have a better way to say it than you changed what I thought my life was going to look like. And I'd like it if you kept doing that." Lily was absolutely motionless, which was not a state that Lily occupies naturally, which meant she had known this was coming and had been waiting for it, and Emma filed that information for later. Emma's eyes were doing the thing again. She was, at this point, simply going to accept that as part of her physical reality when it came to this particular man. She came around the counter. She crossed the floor of the diner, the black and white chessboard floor, to booth 4, and she stood at the edge of it and looked at the velvet box and at the $10 bill beside it, and at the man who had come in at 7:15 every morning for 23 years to keep a promise to his mother. And she thought about Ruth, who had made that promise from a place of love and survived because someone saw her and stayed. And she thought about all the ways that kindness moved through the world, not in straight lines, but in long, slow arcs that took years to complete and landed somewhere nobody had planned. She picked up the velvet box. "Yes," she said. She hadn't opened it yet. She said it before she opened it because the yes wasn't about what was in the box. It was about the whole accumulation of mornings, the coffee and the toast and the $10 and the story told in the rain and the marshmallows on the side and the fall festival and the park and the Sunday dinners, and Dorothy's garden, and Helen Castillo's nod, and Carol's reading glasses on the notebook, and all of it, every ordinary, extraordinary piece of it. Landon stood up. He opened the box himself. His hands were not entirely steady, which was the most human she'd ever seen him. And the ring inside was simple, not showy, exactly what she would have chosen if asked, which she suspected was not a coincidence. Lily made a sound that could only be described as triumphant. The Tuesday couple started clapping, which started Patty clapping behind the counter, which was so unlike Patty that Emma laughed even as Landon put the ring on her finger, and the laugh turned into the kind of crying that didn't feel bad, the kind that was just feeling too much for a body to hold quietly. Fish with Lily, Lily announced to the diner at large, is going to have a wedding episode. Lily, Landon said. What? It's content. Emma laughed again, harder, and Landon was looking at her with the expression she'd spent 2 years collecting and now understood was not a measuring look at all. It was the look of a man who could not believe his luck and was not taking it for granted, not even for a second. The $10 bill was still on the table. Emma noticed it later when the morning had settled back to its ordinary shape. The Tuesday couple finishing their pancakes, Patty retreated to the kitchen, Lily with her hot chocolate and her colored pencils, the light moving across the floor the way it moved every morning. She picked it up. She looked at it. She thought about the anonymous man at May's diner who had walked in one December morning 30 years ago and made a decision that had moved through time like a stone dropped in water, the rings going out and out and out, further than he could ever have measured or intended. She thought about what it meant that a single act, repeated quietly, without fanfare, without needing to be acknowledged, could travel through one life and into another and arrive 30 years later in a diner on Aldrich Street in the form of a promise kept, a woman's life changed, a family beginning. She thought about what she'd learned in 20 months that she hadn't known before, not just nursing, not just the clinical hours and the protocol and the documentation, something more foundational. That the most important things were not the grand gestures or the dramatic interventions. They were the small, repeated choices, the thing you did every morning when no one was watching, the consistent, unglamorous practice of showing up and paying attention and leaving something behind that said you are not invisible. I see you. That matters. She set the $10 bill back on the table. Landon was watching her. It should stay, she said. He understood immediately. Of course he did. Yeah, he said. She sat down across from him, in the seat she'd been sitting in since a rainy November morning that had changed the direction of both their lives. And outside on Aldrich Street, the October sun was doing its long, considered work on the amber leaves, and Lily was narrating the plot of the wedding episode of Fish with Lily to no one in particular. And somewhere across the city, Carol was in her kitchen and would be calling in approximately 1 hour for their Saturday morning check-in, and Emma would tell her, and Carol would say something practical that meant, I love you, and I always knew, and the morning would continue the way mornings did, ordinary and unrepeatable, full of small things adding up to the only life that actually existed, which was this one, right now, unpolished and imperfect and entirely real. The coffee got refilled. The toast came with butter on the side, and on the table in booth 4, a crisp $10 bill lay flat and still in the morning light, the same as it had every day for 23 years, faithful and quiet. The shape a promise takes when kept long enough that it becomes something else entirely. Something that looked, if you knew how to read it, exactly like love.